Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchuk, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchuk Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right, so I am so excited today on the show to be welcoming my guest, Dr. Scott Forbes, who is a specialist in all things creatine and is going to tell us all about creatine specific for runners today. So Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm very excited to be talking about creatine, particularly for endurance sports. I think there's a lot of kind of nuance and context that's important when you're talking about how creatine can benefit runners.
Yeah, fabulous. I'm so excited to dive into it. So before we get to all that, I would love to get to know you a little bit better. If you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself, kind of your origin story as a researcher and how you specifically got interested in creatine.
Yeah, for sure. So I used to be involved in sport. I was actually a paddler. Yeah, I competed in paddling for quite a few years. And then I actually joined the cross-country running team at the University of Saskatchewan. So I ran at the university level for a couple of years and competed in track and field as well. But I was much better at cross-country running than track and field. But I've always had an interest on kind of just improving my own sport performance. And so during my undergraduate degree, I was in kinesiology. I was able to do some research, and that really got me kind of excited about doing research and just, trying to improve my own performance. And then during my master's degree, so I started studying sport nutrition, and my supervisor was Dr. Phil Chillibeck, who's done quite a few research studies on creatine. And I've also been able to collaborate with Dr. Darren Kandow, who's one of the world experts in creatine supplementation as well. So I think just kind of being in the right spot at the right time and just connecting with those two individuals really set me on the path of studying creatine for well over a decade now. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and where I started.
Awesome. And so for anyone who isn't familiar, because some people who are listening to this episode, may not really understand what creatine is. I mean, lots of people maybe have heard the word before, kind of, seen it referred to in the supplement world, but just can you define for us what exactly is creatine?
Yeah, so creatine is really just derived of 3 different amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So anytime you consume a protein source, you're consuming different amino acids that are put together. And creatine is just, those 3 amino acids, so arginine, glycine, methionine. And your body can synthesize its own creatine. So a lot of people don't know that, is that your body is naturally producing creatine all the time. So every single human in the world has creatine within their body. But of course, a lot of people know that you can buy creatine as a supplement, but you can also get it from food sources as well. So there's kind of those 3 different ways to get creatine within your body.
I'm so glad that you made that point and, just put it out there and reminded everyone, for those who don't know, that there is more to creatine than just talking about supplements. And it is something that we find in our bodies naturally and that we also get from food. And so on that note, what are some of those food sources of creatine? Where can we find creatine from dietary sources?
Absolutely. Well, you can consume foods that have a higher source of creatine. So things like salmon or herring, for example, are 2 great sources of creatine, or red meat as well. So those are kind of some of the food sources to boost the amount of creatine within your body. So those are obviously animal-based products. So if you are consuming a vegetarian or vegan diet, you have actually lower amounts of creatine within your muscle. So if you are consuming those animal sources that contain a higher amount of creatine, you're going to have higher levels of intramuscular creatine stores than a vegan or a vegetarian. So that's why actually, at least with regards to responses to resistance training, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you tend to respond better to creatine supplementation compared to if you're an omnivore, if you consume those foods that have a higher amount of creatine in them.
Awesome. That's really interesting. And I think, I often talk a lot about sort of this gray area between like what is nutrition versus what is a supplement, and what we sort of think of as being supplements or things, that we actually get from our diet. Like caffeine would be another example, right? Where we often don't think of that as being a supplement, but it can be for people. And, it really depends on you as an athlete, what your typical diet looks like, what those patterns are, and maybe there are some ways that we can optimize things with a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that for the individual runner.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that actually is I think creatine is one of the most beneficial supplements because it's actually very hard to get in your diet. So even those foods that contain a high amount of creatine in them it's very hard to actually get full saturations of creatine within your muscle from those food sources alone. So that's why most people respond to creatine supplementation, is because it's just so difficult to get from food sources alone. So if you want to get 5 grams of creatine from, for example, salmon, you would have to consume 2.5 pounds of salmon per day to get 5 grams of creatine. And that's kind of the general recommendation.
You need to be really committed.
Yeah, exactly. So it's obviously it's not feasible from a kind of food only approach. And that's why I think that the supplement itself has been so effective. Whereas you've mentioned caffeine, you can get it from coffee. Protein, you don't need a supplement. You can actually get that from good animal or plant-based proteins, from food, things like that. So, but creatine, it's very difficult to get from food sources alone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so then bringing it back to our conversation that we started about creatine specifically for runners and for running performance, how can creatine help runners perform better?
Yeah, so once creatine is taken up into your bloodstream, about 95% of creatine is stored within your muscle. So that's where most of the creatine is going to be found. We also know that creatine can be found in other tissues as well, such as your brain. But once it's in the muscle, about 2/3 gets converted into phosphocreatine, and the remainder remains as what we call free creatine. But essentially, if you have more phosphocreatine within your muscle, that means that you can break that down and produce what's known as ATP very rapidly. So that ATP is basically the energy currency within your muscles. So that allows your muscle to contract and to perform exercise. So if you can get more creatine into your muscle, you get more phosphocreatine, and that gives that energy system is a little bit bigger, and it gives your muscles a little bit more energy. So that's kind of the main way that creatine supplementation works.
Okay, wonderful. So now specifically talking about runners and some of the potential performance advantages for runners, can you share a little bit more about how creatine supplementation might enhance or kind of support running performance?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, running is multifactorial, and trying to measure performance is very, very difficult. So just because we have changes from one day to the next, we know if you're trying to run your best race, you don't always run your best race. And so just those variations in the research world are difficult to kind of tease out. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. But creatine can benefit endurance runners in a variety of different ways. Number one, if you combine creatine with carbohydrates, you can actually get more carbohydrates into your muscles, and that gets stored as glycogen. So that could be a benefit to endurance athletes or endurance runners, is that you're going to have more glycogen in your muscles. And we know that that's a really important fuel source for high intensity running performance. That's why eating, a good pasta meal before running a marathon, for example, is really effective. And having carbohydrates before and during the event is also very effective, is because you can use that fuel within the muscle. So taking carbohydrates with creatine can actually get more carbohydrates into the muscle. So that's pretty cool. And that's one benefit of taking creatine. We also know that creatine can reduce inflammation and oxidative stress following endurance activities as well. So it could perhaps help you recover faster and have kind of less muscle damage following an endurance activity. So that could be of benefit. And so those, and then I would say kind of the third way that creatine could be a benefit for endurance athletes is just by making that energy system that I talked about a little bit bigger. And that particular energy system is really important for really high intensity type activities, which generally for endurance sports, we don't think of it as very important. But we know that during certain events, you might have to run up a hill. You might have to try to surge on somebody, change your pace. And I think in those particular situations, creatine can have a great benefit and could be the difference between winning a race or losing a race.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you mentioned that about, needing those little like bursts of speed and being able to kind of change gears in terms of energy systems while you're in the midst of a workout or while you're in the midst of a race. Because, maybe when you're running a marathon, it is, of course, aerobic in nature. And we're really focusing in on those endurance, that endurance capacity. But for those periods of time, we're kind of racing to the finish line, like getting in those last couple hundred meters, then, there is definitely some benefit in crossing the finish line feeling strong. Now, I wanted to just kind of go back to one of the things that you said here, just so that everyone understands exactly what you mean when you talk about pairing up creatine with carbohydrates. You don't mean to say that you're going to just take creatine as part of maybe your carb loading strategy or take creatine along with carbs as your pre-run meal, correct? The dosing and sort of the timing of the supplement is not just when you feel like you need it.
No, not at all. So but if you do combine those two, it does help with the carbohydrate uptake into the muscle. So you need to consume them at the same time. But those are not the two fuels that you need for endurance events. You need other macronutrients as well. That could be a benefit. Protein is important for even building mitochondria and mitochondrial biogenesis, so the formation of mitochondria. And you need fat as well for health and also exercise performance. So I'm not saying just consume those two fuels, just to be clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of the timing and sort of the dosing, we'll call it, of a creatine supplement, if somebody were to take one, how often would you take creatine? Is there a length of time that someone might take creatine for? What are some of the ins and outs of how you might use that as a supplement?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. And from an endurance perspective, it's not as clear, but we do know that if you take 20 grams per day, and you would separate that into 4 doses throughout the day. So you might take 5 grams in the morning, 5 grams at lunch, 5 grams at dinner, and 5 grams at night to get 20 grams in that day. Then if you do that for 5 to 7 days, you actually get about a 20% increase in creatine stores within the muscle. And that essentially saturates your muscles with creatine. But we also know that if you take a lower dose of creatine, as little as actually 3 grams per day, you can still saturate your muscles with creatine. And you'll still get that 20% increase, but it might take a little bit longer. It might take 28 days instead of 5 to 7 days. So that's kind of 2 different strategies. And what we actually know from the research is if you do that loading phase, you're also going to retain a little bit of water as well. And that could be a benefit in certain situations, like in hot environments, but it could also be of detriment just because you're having more body mass and more weight to carry throughout a race as well. So it's not always a benefit to have more water. And in this situation, perhaps it could be a detriment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, if I were talking to a runner about creatine, I mean, one of the take home messages for me would be, we say nothing new on race day. So maybe the week of your race, you don't necessarily want to do this for the first time leading up to it, just because you don't quite know how that will feel or how you might respond. But definitely to practice with something like this in training, either the kind of loading phase for those 5 to 7 days, or if you're gonna do it a little bit more consistently in training to try and optimize your levels over a longer period of time, it would be something that you would want to do some length of time before the race, as opposed to just throwing something new into the mix the week of.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe this is a supplement more for the off season when you're really trying to build strength and muscle endurance. But as I mentioned, there could be some benefits during the competitive season when you're actually racing as well. But as you mentioned, you would want to try this supplement out just like any other kind of sport nutrition strategy long before the race, and not just 1 week before the event or the day before, just because you don't know how your body is going to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So, what are some of the other benefits or potential benefits that we see with creatine that sort of extend beyond kind of the sport and the physical performance? Because I think a lot of the conversation around creatine is centered around, building strength and building power, and then, perhaps even some of the endurance benefits as well. But I know that there's a lot of really interesting research on creatine that goes far beyond just our lives as runners or as athletes. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that 95% of creatine is stored within the muscle. And I think that's why a lot of the research has focused on kind of muscle and muscle performance. And yeah, it is well established that if you combine creatine with resistance training, that you can get bigger and stronger muscles. So it is one of the few very effective supplements. And we also know that combining creatine with resistance training can also improve bone health as well. And so there's some great research coming out of the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina that has shown that, again, combining creatine with resistance training in either postmenopausal female or older adults can actually improve their bone strength. And they've done studies up to 1 year in duration. And they're actually just finished a 2-year training study with over 260 individuals, participants in the study. So very big, large study. And half of them took creatine, half of them had a placebo, and they resistance trained for 2 years. And I've seen this data presented at a conference, and it's very positive to show that creatine can have a significant effect on improving bone strength over time. So that's a great kind of benefit of creatine. So not only is it going to help your muscle performance, but it also might improve your bone strength. And I think this could be of particular importance for endurance athletes as well, because we know that they are at a higher risk for fractures and things of that nature that can influence their bones negatively. So I think creatine could be a benefit in those situations.
Yeah, and so what the research there showed was that there was a benefit for bone health over and above just the strength training. So the additional creatine supplement showed an extra benefit as opposed to just the individuals who did the strength training portion alone.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it was important that they combined resistance training or strength training with creatine. There's been studies that have been done in Brazil, very, very good studies where they've given creatine for up to 2 years, and they actually showed no benefit on bone health. So that was a very good study, a very long study, great data, but they didn't combine it with strength training, and they didn't show that therapeutic effect of creatine. So that's kind of one thing to take into consideration. But I think even if you are an endurance athlete, you should consider strength training because there's lots of benefits of strength training to enhance endurance performance.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what are some of the other benefits of creatine that go beyond sport performance that you can tell us about?
Yeah, so we also know that creatine can influence your brain and how your brain functions as well. And that's kind of new emerging research. So your brain can actually synthesize its own creatine, which your muscles cannot. So your muscles totally rely on your body's synthesis of creatine, or how much creatine you get in your food or from a supplement. But your brain can actually synthesize its own. But you can get creatine across the blood-brain barrier. It's at a much lower rate than what happens at the muscle level. But we do know that if you supplement with creatine, that you can increase the amount of creatine within your brain, and that can improve brain performance in a variety of different situations, but particularly when your brain is stressed. So there's a couple ways in science that we've stressed individuals' brains. One is with sleep deprivation. So if you're get a lack of sleep, there's some benefits to show that if you take creatine, it could be a benefit in those situations. So we know if you're sleep deprived, your cognition goes down. But if you took creatine, it either did not go down at all or went down less. So that shows some kind of benefits of creatine in that particular stress situation. Another situation is with hypoxia. So that's a low amount of oxygen. So they gave the individuals a low amount of oxygen. Again, their cognition went down. But if they took creatine, again, it lessened that impact of hypoxia on how their brains were functioning. And then we also know that your brain creatine levels are reduced in several other situations, things like concussions or traumatic brain injuries. We know that Alzheimer's disease, so there's some clinical kind of ways that creatine could be of benefit as well. So the research in those particular areas is very limited, but there's definitely some promise and some good rationale for why creatine could be of benefit to enhance brain health in those populations.
Very interesting. And so, talking about the hypoxia, would that translate into like training at altitude or, performing at altitude? Would there be any crossover there?
Yeah, I think so. I think that would be kind of one idea or strategy to enhance kind of performance at altitude is to consider creatine supplementation. That research hasn't specifically been done, but it's just been kind of in an experimental situation in the lab where they gave a low amount of oxygen, made them do some computer tests. One situation they had creatine, one situation they had the placebo. Yeah, I think at altitude, that would be one situation where creatine could have some great benefits. And then we also know that if you go up to altitude, that can impair your sleep as well. So that's going to have kind of a doubly negative effect on your brain and how your brain functions. And so I think creatine could be of great benefit at altitude.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're thinking about this, from the context of performing and, either racing or participating in some kind of events that are taking place outside of your natural environment, or, you're traveling somewhere new that it's going to be different like that, we want to prevent jet lag and we want to hydrate and, do all the things that we can, but also seeing that maybe there are some benefits to something like creatine supplementation just for supporting your performance when you do travel so that you have a positive race day experience and that you feel kind of really good about how everything goes. You're doing everything you can to optimize your performance.
I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah, wonderful. So we've been talking a lot about all of the benefits of creatine and on all the, wonderful and amazing and exciting things that it can potentially do for us. But are there any potential drawbacks to creatine? Like, are there any concerns or even any populations or types of individuals that you would really be cautious about recommending a creatine supplement to?
Yeah, so creatine is one of the safest supplements, and there's been hundreds and hundreds of kind of studies looking at creatine supplementation, and there's no real consistent side effects to creatine. There are a few individuals that might have GI distress or bloating or nausea has been reported in the literature, but it's not consistent and it's relatively rare. So in those individuals, I would suggest perhaps just a lower dose of creatine and maybe mixing the creatine with food, such as carbohydrates, which could be a benefit. But for most individuals, it's perfectly safe and fine to take. And I would say one of the only consistent side effects that has been reported is actually a gain in body mass, primarily due to an increase in water retention, particularly if you do that loading phase. But over time, what happens is it helps you build muscle as well. So that will change how much weight you have because you're going to be building muscle. And that can have an influence on exercise performance. So something to take into consideration, particularly if you're an endurance runner and doing weight-bearing activity, is just that gain in body mass can offset some of the potential positive effects of creatine.
Yeah. And, something that I talk about a lot with my clients, and I really always like to encourage people, is to look at those performance indicators rather than be focused on what the number on the scale is saying, because not all weight gain, of course, is body fat gain or is necessarily a negative thing that we need to be offsetting or trying to reduce, especially if we see creatine being used to help us build muscle, which then translates into better strength and endurance and power in our sport. If we see the scale go up as a result of that, I mean, that's what we're taking the creatine for. Like, that's the point of it. And, that's just one more reason to not maybe be too focused on what the number on the scale is saying.
Yeah, and there's actually a great study from the Australia Institute of Sport. They looked at elite cyclists, and what they did was they gave them creatine with a carbohydrate, and they showed that the group that consumed creatine versus the group that got a placebo and a carbohydrate actually gained body mass. And so they made them actually do a 120 kilometer time trial. And every 10 kilometers, it alternated between a 1 kilometer sprint where they were told to complete 1 kilometer as fast as they can and then continue on. And then the next 10 kilometer interval, they had to do a 4 kilometer sprint. So it went back and forth like that for 120 kilometers.
Oh my goodness.
I would not want to do that particular study, but these were some very highly trained elite cyclists. And what they found was the group that took creatine was able to do the last intervals at a higher power output compared to the group that just took the carbohydrate and the placebo. But the important part of the study, I think, one other important part of the study was that they showed that the group that took creatine gained more body mass, but they also made them do a test at an 8% incline on a treadmill, but it was actually on their bike. So they're pedaling like up this hill. And what they showed was they did a time to exhaustion test. So that's where they just asked them to go basically as long as they can at a certain speed. And they found that the body mass had no impact on that uphill climb. So even though they gained body mass, because they gained enhanced muscle and enhanced power, that offset that gain in body mass. So yeah, if somebody was just looking at body mass, they would be like, no, my performance is going to be worse on this uphill climb. But they actually showed no effect on the uphill climb, and they showed improvements on interval sections of the flat road race.
That is wonderful. I'm so glad that someone else got to do that study for us and that we did not have to be the participants in that study, because that does sound really, really difficult. So congratulations to anyone who was part of that study that had to go through that. But what great information that provides. And I really, really love that you brought up that example in particular, because I think it's something that so many athletes struggle with. And there's a long history of that idea that lighter equals faster and that lighter equals better speeds, especially in running. And I love that we're starting to see some challenges to that kind of idea and some challenges to that belief, and that we can show that no, actually doing things that support better body composition, doing things that support building muscle and building strength actually can translate to better performance. And, when we look at longevity and we're looking at reducing our risk of chronic disease and supporting brain health and everything else that we want to get out of life, we know that there are also tremendous benefits to being stronger as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And some great work from Stu Phillips, he's a Canadian researcher, has really highlighted some of the benefits of resistance training. But even Stu Phillips would suggest combining resistance training or strength training with aerobic exercise. So it's not like you should only do one form of exercise. If you want the best health and longevity, combining cardio and strength training is really the best for health and longevity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so wonderful to hear, other researchers and kind of throughout the scientific community, there just being kind of this bigger push towards that stuff. I think it's so wonderful to hear that. So if somebody were looking for a creatine supplement, if somebody were interested in getting one, from your perspective, what are some of the things that they should look for or maybe not look for? What's kind of your go-to tips when it comes to picking a creatine supplement?
Yeah, so the first question people often ask is what type of creatine? And creatine monohydrate is the best. So first of all, it's the most researched. Secondly, no other alternative form of creatine has been shown to be superior to creatine monohydrate. And then thirdly, it's actually the cheapest form of creatine as well. So I think from those perspectives, I would always suggest creatine monohydrate, even though if you go to a supplement store, they might try to sell you on more expensive alternative forms of creatine. I can tell you that there's no research to support those alternative forms. The second thing I would look for is that it's independently tested. So there's a few organizations such as NSF or Informed Sport. So those are kind of two stamps of approval that you can get on a supplement to show that it's been independently tested. And I think that's important to look for as well. So get creatine monohydrate, just get the powder and make sure that it's independently tested.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I know that I've seen, and I don't know if they're as popular anymore, but years ago, I remember seeing creatine like pills that you could take. And so can you talk a little bit more about the difference between taking something like that in sort of a capsule form versus a powder, and just, what the drawbacks might be of going with the maybe easy to swallow capsule form?
Yeah, so those are perfectly fine. And the effects will be very, very similar. The absorption might be a little bit slower, but for creatine, that's not really your goal, is to absorb it quickly and to, get acute benefits. Usually it's to take creatine over a period of time to build up your creatine stores. So you can take it in a capsule form, but most of the research has been done on powder form. And again, it's just a cheaper way to buy creatine as well. So if powder is not for you and you really like those capsules, then you can for sure buy those capsules.
You just need to take quite a big handful of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to get 3 to 5 grams of creatine, each capsule might be like half a gram. So you're going to be consuming quite a few pills, for example, in the morning.
Yes. And I see that with a number of supplements that are really popular, is that, there's always capsule forms available, but when you have to really look at the dosing and look at, whether or not it makes sense to take it in that form, if it means maybe having to ingest the whole bottle in order to reach the dosing requirement that you want to aim for.
Exactly.
All right. So last question for you today. What are you most excited about when it comes to the research on creatine? You shared so much great stuff with us already about some of the different areas that we're seeing some interest in, some new research coming out on creatine, but what has got you the most excited?
Yeah, so there's lots of kind of areas that we're exploring these days with creatine. Well, one is creatine and endurance performance. I think that creatine can really have a benefit when you're trying to change pace. So have a increase in those surges or intensity. So there's a couple of studies to show a benefit of creatine to enhance those changes in pace. But I think we need to do more research in that particular area, particularly in runners. So it's been shown to be a benefit in cyclists, but there's very limited research in running performance. So I think that's important. So just looking at creatine for endurance performance and trying to simulate in the lab what actually happens out in the real world, where there's, changes in pace and people run by you and you try to keep up with them, or you have a big sprint to the finish. I think those are important to try to replicate in the lab. We also know that combining creatine with resistance training can be of benefit for older adults as well. So we've written a few recent reviews in that particular area to show that creatine could be of benefit to enhance not only muscle, to help retain or build muscle strength, and also enhance function in older adults. But whether it could be of benefit for people with sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is a age-related loss of muscle, so a kind of an extreme loss of muscle and strength and function is one area that I think we need to explore further. And then the impacts of creatine on your brain. As I mentioned, there's emerging evidence in that particular area, but we definitely need more research done on what's the best dose, maybe what's the best time to take creatine or co-ingestion, and what are some of the actual cognitive benefits that you get from creatine.
Absolutely. And, that was one other thing that is, I think, important for a lot of people to kind of listen to and understand is around, timing of some of these supplements. So is there research to show a best time to take a creatine supplement?
Yeah, so I would say over the long term, the best time to take creatine is anytime. But if you're doing that loading phase or you're just trying to increase creatine into your muscles as quickly as possible, I would actually suggest to consume creatine close to your exercise session. So there was a really cool study where they did unilateral leg cycling. So they just had one leg pedaling on a bike and the other leg was just on a block doing absolutely nothing. And then they consumed creatine and they showed that the leg that did the exercise took up the creatine faster than the non-exercise leg. So if you want to get creatine into your muscle quickly, I suggest to take it close to your exercise session. But whether you take it before or after or even during, you're going to get very, very similar benefits.
Okay, so interesting, so interesting. And is there anything else that you want to share or that we should know when it comes to creatine for runners?
So last thing, and probably the most important thing, is creatine does not cause hair loss. So there's people that are all over the internet suggesting that creatine causes hair loss. And it all came from one study where they showed an increased conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, DHT. And DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness. And unfortunately, I'm completely bald here. So I'm not the best advocate to say that creatine does not cause hair loss. But currently, there's no actual evidence, there's no actual study to show that creatine actually impairs your hair in any capacity. So that I think is important for people to understand that creatine is safe, it is effective, it can enhance high intensity exercise performance and perhaps endurance performance as well. And it's one of the few really effective supplements.
Wonderful. All right. That's so interesting. I had not heard the hair loss thing before. So definitely good to end on that point. Thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us all about creatine, sharing your expertise. I appreciate it so much. It's such an interesting area of research that, really does extend so far beyond just our performance as athletes, but really into our overall lives and quality of life. So I know that you share a lot about creatine on your social media, and where can people find you and follow you to continue their education in this area?
Yeah, so probably the best place is on Instagram. So it's Scott_Forbes_PhD. And of course, you can Google search Scott Forbes creatine, and I'm sure you'll find quite a bit of information as well. Or if you're a real scientific nerd, you can go on PubMed and just search up Forbes and creatine, and you'll find quite a few articles that I've published.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was wonderful to have you on. And that is going to be it for today. So thanks again, Scott, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.